thanks to everyone for coming along today. It's the first time we've done a specific fire funding webinar. We're aware that we did do the wider local government webinars fairly frequently, but often that can tend to focus on things like social care and that side of the sector, and we tend to at times neglect fire funding, I think. So we wanted to redress that and have something that just looked at fire funding, specifically around standalone fire authorities, but also covering those fire funding issues within county councils or unitaries where the fire function is still within those organisations. So today we've got three short presentations from me, from Pixel, from Dan, who will look at local authority accounts and fire authority accounts and look at what's going on there in terms of financial standing. And Dan will explain where he gets his data from. It's really interesting analysis that Dan can do. And then we've got Martin from the GLA. He'll talk more about some of the very specific fire things around the precept and around the fire specific grants that are within the settlement as well. Just to confirm, we are recording the webinar and it'll be on the website, probably not tomorrow, probably Monday. It takes me a little while to edit and load the recording, but that will be there. The slides will be on the website later this afternoon. And just to confirm timings, we'll do presentations from 10:45, 15 minutes each, and then Q&A from 10:45 to 11 today. So straight into my presentation. At Pixel, what we do is we advise local authorities and fire authorities on funding and help them understand what's going on in the funding environment and what the forecasts look like for authorities. But just reminding ourselves of what's happened in the past. Core spending power for fire authorities has been, for most of the last 15 years, has been marginally higher than the average for England as a whole. But the increase in real terms in recent years has been slightly below the average. So across the sector as a whole, we've had some pretty big increases in core spending power, but fire authorities have fallen behind on those increases. So by 2024-25, England as a whole was down only 83% in real terms of what it had in 10-11. Combined fire authorities down just over 80%, and metropolitan fire authorities just below the 80% mark. So just slightly below the average for England over that period. Then if we look at all the other authorities across the sector, we can see there that the shire counties and unitary authorities have done better than the average, as have outer London boroughs. But those authorities that have done worse have been Met districts, shire districts, and in London boroughs for various different reasons. But you can see there that on that basis, fire authorities have been fairly close to the average. So what can we expect in 25-26? So we've had a few better indications following the autumn budget about what we might expect in the settlement. We've had a written answer to a written question from the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. So he's forecast what they're expecting to put out in terms of core spending power in 2025-26. That's £68.5 billion. So that's a real terms increase of 3.2%. And in cash terms, we estimate that to be 5.6% if we use the GDP deflator for next year, 2.4%, to adjust into real terms. So what I think that means is a cash terms increase in core spending power of just over 3.6 billion. And that looks like it's 1.3 billion for new grant funding. So that's probably 600 million pounds for social care, 700 million pounds for targeted deprivation funding, then around 2.1 billion in council tax increase, and about 270 odd million pounds if we then assume that SFA is indexed as well. So that suggests other grants will remain fairly static in cash terms, but no cuts either. So that's our expectation anyway. The other question that we had answered was in an urgent question where the Minister of State and MHCLG confirmed that the Band D thresholds will remain in place for next year. He talked about the ongoing commitment to a 5% referendum cap, but crucially for fire authorities, he did not talk about specific thresholds either for shire districts, which last year were the current year of £5, or for fire authorities at all. Didn't mention either of those two things. So we assume either, we assume they're still in negotiation and still working out what those thresholds are going to be. and that will either come out in the policy statement later this month or in the provisional settlement next month. So more specific idea about what we can expect as a prospect for fire authorities next year. So of that new grant funding, as I mentioned, £600 million for social care, £700 million for targeted deprivation funding. And the question is, how much of that £700 million will fire authorities receive? We don't know how they'll do that yet, but I'll suggest some ways that they could do it. Then settlement funding assessment indexation, RSG going up by 1.7% in line with the multiplier increase, baseline funding level increasing by 1.7%, but only for the element that relates to the standard business rate multiplier, and then an increase in cap compensation to compensate you for the freezing of the small business rate multiplier. And they're the cap compensation fractions that we'd expect to see in 25-26. So for fire authorities, an increase in SFA based on those parameters, and also an increase in cap compensation to compensate you for freezing the small business rate multiplier. We're fairly sure now the New Homes bonus will continue in 25-26. Not good news for fire authorities because you don't get any share of that. Had it been discontinued next year, we're pretty sure it isn't now, that 300 or so million pounds would have been redistributed back via services grant, and fire authorities would have got a share of that. Core Band D, no confirmation of that £5 threshold for fire authorities as yet. Services grant, we're assuming, will remain at its current level, but it could be subject to some small movements up or down depending on what the government does with other grants within core spending power. It's effectively the balancing figure for core spending power. Rural Services Delivery Grant, unlikely to change, so we wouldn't expect any impact on fire authorities. The key announcement though for fire authorities is going to be what happens to the minimum funding guarantee. Our assumption is that it will drop, or the rate of support will drop from 4% to around 1%, maybe even down to 0. A lot there will depend on what the government wants to do in terms of distribution across the whole sector. That includes social care authorities and shire districts and fire authorities as well. Obviously, overall core spending power increases next year will be lower than they have been in recent years, 5.6% cash compared to, say, 7.6% cash terms this year. So we would expect that minimum funding guarantee threshold to be lower. Maybe it'd be 1%, maybe it'd be even lower than that. And that's, as we'll see, is a really important factor. Specific fire grants, Martin's going to cover in his presentation a bit later on. And he also covered about employers' national insurance contributions. We're pretty sure that you will get extra funding for the additional employers' NICs contributions. How much you'll get and how it will be distributed on what basis, we just don't know. We assume that's one reason why the policy statement is delayed, because ministers don't quite know how that's going to work as yet. So we'd expect to get something, and we'd expect it to cover roughly your direct costs or direct impact on direct costs, but we just don't know yet. So how might they actually go about doing the targeted deprivation funding? We examined some different methods of doing this. Could they put it just through the existing SFA structure? Would they have some kind of new targeted deprivation indicator? I think they probably would. I think the SFA is too broad. It gives too much money to authorities that have got low levels of deprivation. So I think they'd be looking at something different. So we've modelled something in our MTFP model, which is available to subscribers, where we've used the overall IMD score, which is fairly progressive, and then it gives fairly high scores to the most deprived authorities. It's fairly up to date, but it does come with questions about how do you split that funding then between districts, upper tier, fire authorities, etc. That would need to be done on a discretionary basis. Do you have a lower limit? Do you really focus it on the most deprived? How do you do that? So there's lots of questions that would remain unanswered there. So in the modelling we've done, it doesn't come out particularly well for fire authorities. It's difficult to get, in the modelling approach we've taken, it's difficult to get much of that funding into fire authorities. And I think probably you may find that you don't get very much at all. The overall combined share that you can see there that we've got for combined and Met fire authorities is pretty low. And actually, once you start to take the IMD weighting approach into there, fire authorities would get even less than you would through the SFA. So I think there's a risk there that fire authorities don't do particularly well from that targeted deprivation funding. But, I stress, we just don't know how it's going to happen yet. I have heard this week that what officials are now talking about is that they'll have targeted funding using a deprivation basis for 50% of the new funding, and then 50% based on tax base. So take into account need, and also taking into account your ability to raise council tax. Now, again, that may not work particularly well for fire authorities either. It's almost a double whammy in that you don't get the big increase in council tax because you don't get the £5 threshold. And then if that's then taken into account in that £700 million targeted funding, ministers may say, well, you don't need to raise much money anyway. So it's tricky. I think there's a risk that fire authorities don't do very well from that funding. Even those authorities that you can see on the far right hand side there have got very high deprivation scores. And as I mentioned, MFG is almost the biggest issue, and it will, I think, remain the biggest issue for fire authorities. As you can see there, every fire authority received something in 24-25, and on our modelling, pretty much every fire authority will continue to receive an amount next year, albeit less than they've received this year. That's my forecast. Clearly, that depends on what other grants you get. If you get a bigger share of that £700 million targeted deprivation fund, you would just get less of the MFG. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is ministers might think, well, if fire authorities and shire districts are not getting much elsewhere in the settlement, let's be slightly more generous through the MFG. But that's entirely discretionary. That's entirely what ministers want to do in terms of distribution. So that's something I think that fire authorities will really need to press on to make sure that you do get a fair share from the settlement. And then just illustrating the point that you all know already, you do really need, or every fire authority does need that £5 threshold. It will make a difference. If you looked at that £5 threshold for shire districts now, there's not many shire districts would gain from that. I think it's about 12 authorities that would get a benefit from the £5 threshold. Fire authorities, though, every authority would benefit from having that £5 threshold. So again, that's a really important element in the settlement next month. So in our modelling, we put through all those changes that were announced in the autumn budget, the updates that we've seen from various ministerial answers, and also our assessment of how they might do the deprivation funding. And as you can see there, overall cash terms increase for England 5.6%. Authorities with social care responsibilities doing around the average. Met authorities or high need unitaries doing better than the average. So you can see there, Met's doing increased by 6.5%. Shire counties doing slightly less than the average, so 6.4%, for instance. But that's kind of as you'd now expect. This new Labour government will be moving money towards higher need authorities and away from the more affluent shire counties. But you can see there, combined fire authorities, we're estimating 2.7% cash terms increase. Met fire authorities 2%. So not doing particularly well in these numbers. A lot, though, will depend on whether fire authorities receive any of that targeted deprivation funding, and what ministers do around the MFG. But you can see there the difference between combined fire authorities and the Met fire authorities. The Met fire authorities, you just don't have the tax base to grow as much, to increase your council tax revenues as much as the combined fire authorities do. So that's where we are with our modelling that you get within our MTFP model. Looking a bit further ahead, ministers are pretty much committed now to doing funding reform for 26-27. I think it's pretty inconceivable that they wouldn't do something for the year after next, 26-27. They're very much looking at deprivation. They're very much looking at reflecting resources, in other words, council tax equalisation. But we don't know how much of that will include what happens in fire, or what your share of that funding would be. There are some really big risks for fire, particularly around the tier split for council tax that's used within the settlement. We can talk about that at a later date. And Martin's got some slides on what the new formula might look like. Part of the problem, I think, and this is an issue for fire authorities too, is that the timetable now is really tight. There's a lot that has to be done really, really quickly. Ideally, you'd have a bit more time to create a new fire formula. I'm not sure whether that will be the case, but Martin might have some different ideas. And kind of looking that bit further forward, the prospects for the future are not great either. Maybe 1% real terms growth for the for public sector as a whole, slightly more than that, but for non-protected services, that's likely to be a real terms cut. And as we've seen for the 25-26 settlement, any resources that are available are much more likely to go to upper tier authorities, much more likely to go to social care, and that I think is a long-term risk for fire. A quick slide just about process over the next 18 months. We are expecting a policy statement in advance of the provisional settlement. I'd heard rumours it was going to be Monday this week, then it was Wednesday. I think the latest is it could be sometime in the next 2 weeks. So that could be even into early December. So that might only be a couple of weeks before the provisional settlement. The provisional settlement, the date's been advertised as the 19th of December, which is the last day before Parliament rises. I think it'll be in that week. I don't think you can be guaranteed that it will be on that date. So we're looking at the last week before Christmas for the provisional settlement. I'd expect some kind of consultation paper on principles around funding reform at the same time, just because they need to get started on that quickly. Phase 2 of the spending review in the spring, and then we really need to be seeing the full consultation papers on funding reform. They've talked about the spring. I wouldn't be surprised if it is delayed back into July, just before the summer recess, and then the full implementation of multi-year budgets, funding reform, and all the rest of it, and the spending review in December 25 in readiness for 2026-27. So it's a pretty packed programme, I think. And Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. So I hope no one's got their Christmas dinners booked for the 19th of December. So I'm, if you move on one, please, Adrian, I'm going to have a look at the accounts, I'll have a look at a little bit at the backlog, then quite a bit on balance sheet health, and then talk a little bit more about council tax and the importance of council tax for fire authorities and the redistributions that Adrian's pointed to, and then that sort of allowed me to sort of move in very quickly to CTB1 data, which came out early last week, and for which I've done a little bit of analysis for fire authorities. If we move on one. So we'll start the accounts audit backlog. When we came, Adrian and I came to the fire conference on the 25th of September, nearly 2 months ago, isn't it? Showed the same thing, and since then, 2 more 22-23 opinions have been received, which feels quite slow, 1 a month, given that this is a backlog that we're trying to catch up. But with the exception of just one combined authority now, all fire authorities have published their 23-24 accounts, and they all published 22-23. So the first backstop date, as far as the accounts are concerned, will be met. But it does feel a bit slow. I don't know. The proportions are very similar to local authority. If you've, other than some local authority 23-24 opinions are coming out now, but it feels like there's going to be a whole load there that might be in that period where the opinions won't be ready for the backstop date, and you'll get what do you call them? The not a full opinion. I forgot what they're called now. It's with D. So the what's that? Sorry.
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer. Yeah, sorry about that. So it'd be interesting to. It feels like same as local authorities. It doesn't feel particularly great. I'm sure if you're sitting on 2 or 3 years worth of accounts that still haven't been audited and auditor that's disappeared, it won't feel great to you either. But something we might pick up in the chat afterwards. If we move on to balance sheet health then. So we took we've done this with local authorities, districts and upper tier authorities, and we decided to have a look at fire authorities along the same lines. We followed the SIP for FM code, which is basically the old SIP for Solace code with a really important overlay around financial resilience. All that I put there in yellow is that overlay, and we took that. We thought that was a really good piece of work. It's a shame that the FM code kind of came forward and then it seems to have retreated a little bit, but lots of authorities are doing compliance checks against it. But we think it's a good piece of work, and it's particularly around the balance sheet that we've sort of worked on. So if we move on one, So we created for fire, there are 15 measures over 4 categories. Look at the bottom line, the net assets, the reserves, remove pensions from that. You have some whopping pensions deficits, but I'm given to understand that the government is still kind of funding those. We then look at usable reserves, capital health, and then the interplay between current resources, reserves and other things, and capital health and the amount that you've got borrowed. It's a big issue that with local authorities. We have this sort of a glance view that, for this particular authority, we can see that it's got a lot of pressure because it's got a lot of, its balance sheet has got a lot of measures that appear to be in the bottom quartile compared with the other 28 authorities that have published. But actually, it's done in terms of direction of travel on that right-hand side. It seems to be climbing out of that, so it seems to be doing relatively better more recently. But if we move on and have a look at some of those main headers, so what I can see, if I look at your net assets, they're sort of level, but they're starting to touch down a little bit, and that is almost entirely due to reserves and usable revenue reserves, particularly, that are now falling reasonably significantly and at reasonably similar levels to what's being observed with upper tier authorities. Arguably, that's not sustainable. You can't afford for continued reductions in reserves, and some of the funding outlet that Adrian went through, it would seem to me that you're going to have more pressures. Can particularly see that reserves at Mets are that much lower than the fire average, and they're reducing a little bit more quickly as well, which is possibly an issue, and I think possibly ties into funding as well and council tax gearing, which we'll come on to. If you move on, Adrian, please. That's looking at all the authorities that have published accounts for 23-24, usable revenue reserves as a percentage of core spending power. You can see there's quite a variety there, but what's really, really interesting is the change in reserves, with one exception where reserves went up, pretty much, and one or two have gone up just a little bit. The reserves are depleting, and depleting at rates that aren't sustainable. So it'll be really interesting next year to see if that pattern continues. We'll speak to upper tier local authorities. They expect it to. It would be interesting to know from you guys what you think in terms of your reserves. They're not massive, your level of reserves in fire. By any means, district councils have much higher levels of reserves than upper tier. Fire is much more similar to upper tier levels of reserves generally. If we move on, I think we next look at capital health. So I don't see big issues in capital health that I can see at some local authorities, some councils. But I do start to see, particularly around Mets, that the need to borrow is increasing. And when I showed these slides at the fire conference, quite a few people said that, yeah, we've got a load of pent-up demand for capital. We've got a lot of replacement to be doing, etc. So actually, yes, our capital financing requirement might be in a safe place, but we know we've got to do some capital investment over the next few years. And at that point, I think I gauge from speaking to people that I might expect capital financing requirements to go up a little bit more. Capital financing requirements really important. Need to borrow is really important. We also think it's important to look at your capital adjustment account, which effectively is a view as to whether you're funding your assets at a rate that's commensurate with the rate at which they're depleting. And when you take the equity accounts on your balance sheet and the need to borrow, you've got your debt gearing and equity gearing ratio, which we think is an important one to look at. And there, what we're seeing is nothing particularly bad for fire at the moment. If I was to show you that for Slough or for Croydon, you just see a gearing that's going up and up and up, as well as a capital finance requirement is. It feels to me like capital health in the sector, fire sector, is not too bad, but I can start to see it edging, the need to borrow edging up, and that might become an issue. If we move on one, you'll see there that there's clearly a couple of combined authorities there that are weighing into a fair bit of capital investment. Capital finance requirement having increased quite significantly, and quite a few Mets where there's more investment going on. But generally, the capital finance requirements are sort of steady, or they're coming down as a proportion of CSP. if we move on, finally to the sort of the interplay between resources and capital health. And here we look at a number of things. We can see current ratios, particularly for METs, coming down with less cash about. We can see that reflected in receivable interest income in the financing note as well. But in the bottom right there, I see something that I can see in upper tier lots of, and I suppose would be quite worrying, and that's internal borrowing over current resources. So at the point that your current resources keep dropping, the amount that you're using to internally borrow, so that you're having to as part of your need to borrow, if your resources keep dropping, there'll come a point where you no longer have the cash available to sustain internal borrowing. At that point, you have to externalize that borrowing. I'm seeing at one or two authorities a big increase in short-term borrowing because clearly they're running out of cash a little bit, and therefore their interest payable will go up. So that, in the upper tier, that's a real threat, and I'm starting to see bits of that in fire. It'd be interesting again to see if that's something that you'd identify with. And if you move on another slide, Adrian. So internal borrowing over current resources, you can see there that there's some authorities where, those on the left of the top graph, their internal borrowing levels are higher than the current resources. So that usually means that before too long, they're going to have to externalize some borrowing because they haven't got the cash resources swimming around to sustain their internal borrowing position. What we also see is that as cash resources move, the interest receivable gets squeezed and interest payable goes up, and that becomes a revenue budget issue, doesn't it? So if we move on now to a bit more to funding, and this is where you feel free to agree or disagree with this. I can see if I look at spending power increases and I look at the reliance on council tax, those with very low reliance on council tax are falling behind in terms of spending power because they tend to have low tax bases, low tax base increases, and given there's no resource equalisation, that those with higher tax bases just race ahead because they can get more from the same council tax increase that's been imposed through the thresholds than those with lower. So, for instance, there you can see 5 of the METs much lower increases in spending power because they have low tax bases. And I therefore would expect fair funding when it comes along to impose some form of equalisation that might help those authorities. If we move on another one, Adrian. And this demonstrated, I've used Tyne and Wear here. I can see that Tyne and Wear got very high band D, a very low tax base and reasonably low tax base growth, which means that despite having a band D, their council tax income is still less than the average fire authority, despite having a band D that's quite a bit higher than the average fire authority. And it's the same in districts because there's been no equalisation, meaning that those with low tax bases and or low tax base growth are gradually falling behind. For upper tier authority, that's equalised because social care grants have equalised that to a degree because the deprivation is a big part of that. But no such equalisation exists for fire as it doesn't for districts. So over the last 15 years, I would imagine there's been quite a big redistribution towards high tax base authorities, which tend to be low needs, from low tax base authorities that have lost out. And finally, final 3 slides, if we move on, just looking at CTB. CTB1 came out last year. Strange one, CTB1. It's not your CTR, but it's the annual look at tax base and how that's moved, how it's grown. And first of all, that should say tax base per head, that graph. I'll change that before I send them out. So it won't surprise you that Surrey, West Sussex have the highest tax base per head. Therefore, they will have done reasonably well from funding over the last few years because council tax is a much bigger part of that. And it won't surprise you that the likes of Tyne and Wear, West Midlands and the other METs are at the lower end. So that's according to 2024, your tax base per head, not your tax base change, which is the next slide. We move on to that. And this is strange. For years and years, the southeast has tended to grow a lot more than the northeast and the northwest. But in this last year, according to tax base figures, there's quite a differential. So the north, the northwest, the northeast, Yorkshire and Humberside are growing actually more than the southeast and the southwest is. So in terms of growth this year, you see authorities like Cumbria and Northumberland quite a bit of growth, and therefore might do a little bit better from council tax. And some of the authorities to the right here with low levels of growth, Hampshire, West Sussex and Surrey are all in that lower growth where. So actually that tax-based advantage that they've had in the past is slightly less this year. So that's from the 2024 CTB1. So that presumably when you're all starting to try to think about what your tax back, what your council tax income will be, this sort of analysis would help you understand where your tax base might grow. Because I'm guessing you guys rely very much on your districts and your unitaries to provide you with those tax base figures as and when. So in terms of doing your own sort of planning, you're reliant a little bit on the authorities, the billing authorities in your area. And then the last slide for me, it's just an interesting one, is second home. So your billing authorities will have had to indicate that they were going to charge the second home premium, which I believe is up to twice as much as the council tax rate that's on. So second home owners might pay double council tax, and that's for the first time from next year. And when I look at second homes and where they are and do that by fire authority, I took Isles of Scilly off the list because they're 11% second homes. It would have just squashed everyone down. So I've removed those. But you won't be surprised that areas like Cornwall and Cumbria, Norfolk will do quite well. And those fire authorities should expect to do reasonably well from, Cornwall, 5% of their homes second home. If they've chosen to double that, that's quite a big boost in tax base. But you can see here that there's some real variations. Just saying this, we all started. I was surprised Camden in London, 6% second homes, according to the CTB data, which surprised me a little bit. But there you have where you'd be in terms of the additional income that might accrue from second homes. But that's dependent on your billing authority having indicated that it's going to charge that second homes premium. This is a bigger issue, I think, going forward. And that's me. Thank you very much. Move on to Martin.
Yes, thanks very much, Dan. So I'm just going to cover a slightly more personal perspective in my role as finance manager at the Greater London Authority. So my team leads on the Mayor of London's budget consolidation process, and also clearly as one of the key roles that we have to undertake is prioritising resources and funding between local government services, the GLA, housing, planning, etc., Transport for London services, the Met Police and the Fire Brigade. And also we've got a couple of mayoral development corporations in relation to the 2012 Olympic Park in Newham, and also the Old Oak Common Park Rail Development Corporation, which is obviously the planned terminus until it's extended to Euston for HS2. So there's obviously a number of competing priorities and challenges and pressures at the moment right across all those authorities. But obviously we have to play a key role in then determining how those resources should be allocated. So in a sense, we do get that perspective that, county authorities will get in terms of, being part of a wider organisation, also mayoral combined authorities with fire functions where, the mayor has power to allocate business rates and council tax at his discretion. So obviously it's just giving that personal perspective. I think I probably started off, rather than you might expect a picture of a fire station, just a picture of our new city hall surrounded by a number of high-rise blocks, which obviously just highlights, that fire funding has and should have become much more up the agenda since the Grenfell Tower fire and, the government response and the inquiry to that, because clearly, there are particular challenges that are being faced in urban areas in terms of responding to that, areas with concentration of high-rise buildings, but there are similar pressures in rural areas and coastal areas in terms of managing the particular local challenges that you face. So you would hope that, the issue of fire funding has gone up the government agenda and the Home Office agenda, and we'll obviously wait and see how the new government responds to that. And I was also, wrote for the TIS Online at SIPFA in terms of the government grants and business rates section on fire. So I can sort of bring that perspective in terms of trying to understand how the fire funding system works across the country and also specifically in London. So Adrian, moving on to the first slide, I think this is the initial issue and challenge in terms of the fire sector, is that it's complex and evolving in terms of the structures. So we have, hopefully I've got the latest numbers, around 45 fire and rescue services in England, but they range hugely in size from the Isles of Scilly with only a couple of thousand residents, the London Fire Brigade with over 9 million. You've got a number of fire authorities which are coterminous with former county council areas, you know, and obviously the Cornwall Unitary Authority in the Isles of Scilly. You've got combined authorities in metropolitan, non-metropolitan county areas, and obviously you've had some recent mergers such as Dorset and Wiltshire. And then merging more recently, following the Mayor of London taking over responsibility for the Fire Brigade and the Met Police in 2001, you know, several metro mayors have taken over responsibility for the local fire services. And then you have some legacy metropolitan fire authorities in the remaining former Met counties, Merseyside, West Midlands, Tyne and Wear. So it's slightly odd why, you know, you have different arrangements in Greater Manchester to say Merseyside, but I think that just reflects the evolving devolution arrangements are in place. And also you have the 4 police, fire and crime commissioners in Cumbria, Essex, Staffordshire and Northamptonshire, which obviously have evolved in the last few years following legislation. So this just all adds to the complexity in relation to the funding and precepting arrangements, and actually the understanding in central government about how it works, and also the transparency, particularly where the Fire and Rescue Service is part of a larger authority, where it's whether it's a mayoral combined authority, the Mayor of London, a county council, in terms of potential loss of visibility and just getting your concerns and issues up the agenda, given all the challenges around police funding or you know, social care funding that are being faced by authorities right across the country. And obviously, you know, we do recognise that, you know, we've got significant challenges in relation to fire brigades funding in London, probably the worst sort of budget challenge we faced since the early years following, you know, austerity under the coalition government. But, you know, I'm sure, you know, all your authorities, as recognised by the lobbying that's been done of central government, you know, are facing very similar challenges. But I think this just highlights the complexity. And obviously, I understand that one of the reasons why policy statement is being delayed is sort of government looking at reorganisation in terms of, you know, local government. So what that potentially means for the fire sector moving forward, we'll have to wait and see. But obviously, you know, it is a complex structure, and I think that does create some significant challenges in terms of the funding arrangements. So if we move forward to the next slide, I suppose probably just slightly more London focused perspective on things, but I think it just highlights the sort of scale of the operations that we have to manage in terms of London Fire Brigade. So obviously over 9 million residents, 300 spoken languages, obviously creates some challenges in terms of the wider community engagement work, and also 70% of England's high-rise buildings. You know, the gross expenditure budget was over, you know, approaching 580 million, likely to approach 600 million in 25-26. But clearly the big challenge is that 80% of the costs are spent on staffing and related items such as pensions. And the vast majority of staff are operational firefighters. Also, we published our Community Risk Management Plan in January 2023, which obviously set out the Commissioner's plans for the next 5 or 6 years. But the part of the big challenge that the sector has is that it's heavily reliant on grant funding, revenue support grant, retained business rates, council tax precept for the vast majority of its income. There's relatively little, you know, revenue raising capacity compared to, you know, other services, and there's relatively low level of Home Office specific grants. So, you know, even the London Fire Brigade gets relatively little, and a large portion of that is legacy PFI money, and also some money for sort of Merton Fire Control Centre. So, you know, the sums now pensions grant has been rolled into the MHCLG settlement are relatively small in terms of specific grants. So you're very much reliant on funding that's primarily coming through the MHCLG settlement. And then you have the challenge of, well, you know, Home Office is a responsible department, but MHCLG seem to be dealing with the vast majority of funding issues. But then in terms of going back to the London perspective, you know, we have a functional body called the London Fire Commissioner with its own deputy mayor, and then there's oversight through the London Assembly Fire Committee, but it's part of a much wider group, as I've indicated, with several functional bodies as well as the GLA and the London Assembly. So while, yes, it has nearly £600 million budget, it only accounts for 5% of the total GLA group budget. So there is the risk that its voice and its concerns can get lost in the wider budget debate, because to the discussions around police, transport funding, housing funding can often take priority, and similarly in local authorities, counties, you know, debates around adult social care, children's services, you know, emerging challenges elsewhere around temporary accommodation in unitaries, it does become quite a challenge in terms of the sector getting its voice heard. So if we move on to the next slide, so this is just a bit of a funding perspective. So in terms of 24-25 settlement, around £975 million through settlement funding assessment for the sector. You know, it's slightly distorted in terms of split between RSG and baseline funding level, because 100% of the London Fire Brigade's funding comes through baseline funding because of its business rates pilot. So when you adjust for that, it's potentially around sort of 2 to 1 in terms of the business rates retention versus RSG split. Now, clearly that's quite important, because the RSG should be outrated by the sort of 1.6% uplift in settlement funding assessment, or uplift for the increase in the business rates multiplier. But we're assuming that that will also be applied in the same basis to baseline funding level, but clearly we'll have to wait and see what's set out in the settlement. There's clearly enough money to do that, but obviously it depends on the prioritisation and decision making of ministers, particularly around their sort of focus on delivering deprivation. And I think, as has been highlighted, you know, will fire qualify for any of these extra £700 million? And if it does, how will that be allocated? And will all authorities get some money, or will it only go to the most deprived authorities, perhaps from the government's perspective, to reverse some of the distorting impacts of the fire formula changes 10 years ago, which did direct resources in a certain direction, which may not be necessarily where they want to go, or which they may seek to reverse. So Adrian, if you move on to the next slide. So again, obviously Dan's already covered the fire precept angle. So fire precepts obviously are certainly a lot lower than police precepts. You know, they average around sort of £85 per bandy property, but they range potentially from as low as £60 to £118 this financial year. So obviously some authorities have got, you know, double the precept at bandy level of other authorities, but clearly there are distortions created by tax base and also the revenue raising capacity locally. And see, Dan's covered the tax base angle, but one thing we're noting in London is that a number of outer London boroughs are considering very significant changes to their council tax support schemes, which is likely to mean very large increases in their tax bases as a result of, you know, having to charge additional sums on some of the most low income and vulnerable working age households. So we had one borough that, you know, made a significant change, and its tax base increase was about 1.5% at the previous year, and it went up to 6%. And if that's replicated across 10, 15 outer London boroughs, that could heavily distort the numbers. And if there are other building authorities in your area with significant challenges around their budgets and council tax support or the unitaries, then obviously they could be looking to do the same thing, because they're running out of options in terms of making savings. Clearly, in terms of the total precepts raise, you know, if you exclude the county fire authorities, potentially well over 1.3 billion. Clearly, there's obviously challenges in terms of capturing and highlighting the county data, because it's not published separately, and that's always, and that's probably the emerging challenging issue as well, with you know, the move to mayoral combined authority structures and oversight, where, and you know, the fire structure as well, in terms of integrating with PCCs in some areas, that you can tend to lose a lot of visibility around the fire numbers. And again, moving on to referendum principles, sorry, going back, Adrian, the fire sector has been subject to the same referendum limits as local government in recent years, or perhaps shire districts. Obviously, there's always the debate about, you know, is it 3% or £5, whichever is the greatest, but it's notable that the percentage increase has been much lower than they've been applied to the police sector. So, you know, the police precept rises have always been monetary amounts for the last few years, ranging was £10 to as much as £24, which was the figure in 1920, which was equivalent to an 11% rise in, certainly in the Met's precept, and presumably similar figures for PCCs right across the country. And we expect, you know, the £13 limit this year to be repeated in 25-26, which for us is over 4%. So why are the Home Office happy to allow very large increases percentage-wise for police every single year, but they're responsible department for fire, but why not allow fire to have at least the same percentage increases? So why is it only 3 for you, but potentially over 4%, approaching 5% for the police? So what is the logic of the Home Office's approach? They don't have to do what MHCLG do. Clearly, it would have to be discussed with Treasury. But if the sector is facing challenges, why not give you the same flexibility that police do have, certainly the last few years, and we assume again in 25-26. So moving on to the next slide, specific grants. So clearly the most significant specific grant, fire pension grant, was rolled into RSG retained rates in 24-25. but we understand some additional funding is likely to be provided in 25-26 due to the actuarial review. We don't know, we're not clear at the LFB how that's going to be provided, whether that comes through extra Home Office grant or whether that gets rolled into the MHCLG settlement. It's slightly odd to have rolled in the core grant into the MHCLG settlement and then providing additional money through a separate arrangement in 25-26. We'll have to see how that worked. But it's also very noticeable that the fire pension grant, what was rolled in, was frozen in 24-25. But by contrast, the police pension grant was more than doubled by the Home Office. So what was the rationale or logic for that? And, you know, as I've highlighted, how will that be managed in 25-26? Clearly, the level of specific grants is also much, much lower than in terms of police. I mean, you're looking at police funding of being well over £1 billion. I think in terms of core fire grants, it's probably 30-40 million across the country. A lot of those are legacy grants for PFI or sort of control centres. So the actual level of specific grants is relatively small compared to other sectors, which obviously therefore limits the control that the Home Office have over the settlement if they're effectively handing over RSG, retain rate, settlement funding assessment to MHCLG to allocate. So it'd be interesting to see how that will be responded to by the Home Office in this coming settlement, whether they'll just leave it to MHCLG and just apart from pensions grant funding and the small amount of specific grants funding, just manage that separately and then focus their energy on police funding. So if you move on to the next slide, Adrian. So 25-26 issues and risks. So clearly we have the employer NI pressure. You know, I mean, what I'm trying to do here is sort of looking at what we understand to be the figures for the London Fire Brigade and multiple them by 4 in relation to sort of how the funding works. So clearly that's an estimate, but is a potential cost of £30 million for the sector. How will it be funded? How will it be managed for different tiers and structures where you have counties, GLA, Mayoral Combined Authorities? Will the services be granted as used in 22-23 or a different arrangement? Firefighters pay, you know, large increase in 24-25, but what will be happening in 25 for the 25 pay award? You know, potentially every extra 1% adds up to £15 million to fire budgets. I think we've been budgeting at 2%, but it might be higher than that, obviously, depending on negotiations. Clearly, there's the ongoing costs and pressures for urban forces due to the Grenfell response, you know, and obviously we've had particular challenges with the LFB in terms of cultural change issues and responding to, you know, HMIC FRS recommendations. And obviously there's other challenges in rural areas where we retain firefighters and just general capacity. Will the uplift in RSG and SFA be sufficient, plus the precept uplift to cover pressures? Unlikely. You know, we had earlier this week a Home Office announcement of £500 million for extra neighbourhood policing funding, but no indications yet on additional support for fire services from the Home Secretary. So we'll have to wait and see in terms of that and how that's managed, and whether the Home Office will do anything to support the fire sector as well as the police sector. And then, Adrian, moving on to the next slide. So then we have issues from 26-27 onwards. Potential funding, fair funding review. Will this include a review of the fire formula? But even if the fire formula isn't changed, census and population data will need to be updated if they're reviewing the local government and police formulae, and there'll be consequential impacts from, you know, change to the area cost adjustment, resource equalisation around council tax. You know, the area cost adjustment has been updated with the schools funding formula for the last few years, and clearly that obviously provides an uplift to, you know, the London Fire Brigade and authorities in the southeast and some urban authorities, but other authorities get no benefit from that at the moment. So how's that all going to be managed? We assume the 2% business rates retention share stays, but that's obviously not a consistent position across the piece, because if you're part of a Mayoral Combined Authority or London or County, obviously you can potentially benefit from the additional shares that your parent authorities have. Got a business rates reset, review and revaluation, top-ups and tariffs in our case, and business rates baselines could change materially as a result, and therefore further uncertainty, even if we get multi-year settlements, because of all those changes. And presumably if there's a formula change, there would have to be some damping as well. And I think I'd probably just end on the, see, Adrian highlighted the sort of potential changes to the fire funding formula. This is just a summary of the current formula on the final slide. So if you just move to the next one. So obviously there's various indicators linked to population and various top-ups. Coastline population density, which obviously got significantly adjusted in when it was last reviewed in 2011-12. There's deprivation top-up, high-risk top-up, property and societal risk top up and community fire safety top up. So there's a number of different indicators and factors that form part of that, and I provided the link to the 2011-12 local government finance report. So I think that was potentially the last time this was all actually properly produced and issued, because from 2013-14 onwards, obviously they've moved to rates retention, and there hasn't really been much focus or use on the existing fire formulae or the other formulae for the wider sector. But clearly, if they're doing a fair funding review, this will have to come back, and they will presumably need some sort of focus on this over the next 12 months. So we obviously look forward to the engagement that MHCLG and the Home Office will have with the wider sector around how that might work, and if they are planning changes. But even if they don't, if there's changes made to local government, there will be consequential impacts in terms of ACA and resource equalisation. So I hope that's just a helpful update on some of the issues and challenges. I mean, we got really big challenges in terms of the London Fire Brigade. I'm sure you have as well. So obviously useful in the last few minutes. Apologies, I've slightly overrun, just to pick up some of those issues and challenges, concerns that you have moving forward, and how we manage the 25-26 settlement, but also challenges in future years as well.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Martin, for that. That's fantastic. Good to hear that analysis. And I mean, throw it up to the floor really. If anyone's got any questions or comments, either about the specifics of the settlement, which we're expecting next month, or further ahead. Mark.
Yeah, not so much a question, just really a few kind of comments on kind of my understanding some of the bits that we touched on. So thank you all for the presentations, really useful. Around the employers NI funding, my understanding from speaking to Home Office, it will be fully funded. There's just a challenge over how it's distributed. For fire, it probably won't be through an existing mechanism. We'll probably try to look to do something bespoke that accurately reflects the costs faced by individual services, but it's going to be really tricky, because at what point do you take a snapshot? It's a bit of a moving feast. There's other things kind of going on with on-call changes and stuff like that. So, but we're going to try and do it the best way possible. In terms of the fire formula, I think given timescales, it's probably just going to be an update of data rather than a new formula. But any changes brought about by doing that are going to be dwarfed by whatever decisions are made around resource equalisation and council tax. That'll have the major impacts that I think we've said in the past. Policy statement, I'm expecting next week, I've been told, and it will set out council tax referendum principles. But as we know, dates of kind of publications like that are subject to change. So, but I'm keeping fingers crossed for next week. Dan, you made a really good point around the council investment as mentioned at the conference, in terms of what people are projecting is probably what they can afford rather than what they actually need. We've got a guy called Kieran Timmins who's looking at kind of spending review for not next year, but the 2 years after that. One of the kind of the gaps in data is actually what do people need? So we might look at, there's a property survey which a guy at Scotland's led on, but he's only had like 4 or 5 responses. So I think that might get broadened out, because that looks at kind of property both in terms of condition, but also suitability, stuff like EDI contaminants and stuff like that. So we're hoping if we can start to get some of that together, that really will help us with kind of our ask and needs around the capital funding bit. And just around the pensions grant that we're receiving this year that hasn't been rolled into the base due to the change in escape discount rate, my understanding is that will be rolled into the base for next year. And they're also looking at the quantum of it, because a number of services said they're kind of slightly short on it. There was kind of some further data that's come in since that was done. So kind of Home Office are on our behalf going back to Treasury saying, look, we need a bit more on that as well. But yeah, it should hopefully be rolled into the base, because as Martin said, it makes no sense to have 2 separate pensions grants, one rolled in, one not. So hopefully that's useful, just give a bit of extra context to some of those bits.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. I mean, I think particularly the next funding will be in that. My guess is that's the thing that's slowing things up more than anything else, because there's big issues about money, but also about distribution. I wonder whether in the wider local government sector whether that sort of specific approach is possible. I mean, it'd be great if they can do that for fire, but I don't know. I don't know how applicable how easy is that to scale is across the sector. Martin Rehan, do you want to say something as well?
Just a couple of things on what Mark said. If we do the pensions grant first, there is a logic for keeping it separate from government's point of view, which is, or I think there is that at the grant is supposed to cover the scape element of the change and not the actual scheme element of the change. And the advisors, actuarial advisors to the SAB, Advisory Board, are suggesting that the scape rate just moves such that at the next valuation it might move the other way. So keeping the grant separate makes it much easier to take the grant back again. If you rolled it into the settlement, then it's much harder to take out. So there's an argument of keeping it separate, not that fire authorities necessarily support that, but the government might. And the other one was just around the NI changes, and if we're doing trying to do a sort of bespoke allocation somehow for the service, just need to be cautious how we take account of shared services, where you might have an employer with the NI costs, but they're passed on or not passed on, and it's a bit of a concern for us with some of the services we take from the PCC, whether the PCC will get the benefit of the NI change and we have to pay the NI change as well. So just to bear in mind.
Martin Mitchell, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it was just on the NI point, because obviously the government have committed to funding the costs for the sector in full and the wider public sector as a whole. But my concern is, do they actually have the data to ensure that's allocated fairly in the appropriate individual authority or body level? Because clearly they don't have the full data on direct employee costs, which is obviously what they've committed to funding. And clearly there are different levels of outsourcing, perhaps less so in the fire sector, but across local governments. Obviously, there's a big challenge around social care. You know, obviously they've got to fund TfL, for example. You know, all our bus operators are outsourced, so you know there'll be additional costs for bus drivers. How is that all going to be managed? And do they actually have? They can provide a sort of a figure and say we're funding it, but how can they guarantee that when they don't have the data? I mean, they're going to have to do a data collection exercise and pay money on advance and do a reconciliation exercise based on outcome, or are they going to just do what was done in 22-23 and just use some existing formula to allocate a pot of money, which obviously mean that some authorities may get more money than they need and others get less. I just don't quite understand how they can deliver that commitment given the complexity of the public sector, bearing in mind they've got to fund central government, the NHS, and now we got a commitment to fund, hospices, care sector, and I think that's probably just my concern. Will they need to put the quantum up, and how they're actually going to do it, and how they're going to deliver on their actual commitments and properly fund things, particularly when there's a lot of outsourcing involved, as there is, in social care and other services. So that'd be interesting to see how they manage to do that across the public sector as a whole.
Yeah, I personally, Martin, I think that's really quite tricky. I mean, it's quite a commitment to try and do that, and I think there's so many rough edges to this that I think they'd be easier in the end just using some existing distribution mechanism rather than trying to replicate the complex reality of the real world. My other concern actually is what Martin Rehan said, which is about if funding for fire for specific things is rolled into the formula, how is that treated when they calculate your minimum funding guarantee? So if they put more funding through, say, pensions funding, which is already rolled into SFA, is that included or excluded when it comes to calculating your MFG? Because if it's just taken into account as part of the overall package, the chances are that additional funding for something may not actually come through to your bottom line. That'd be my concern about specific funding that's changing on a different basis to the rest of the settlement when it's rolled into that wider settlement. Okay, any other points? Mark, I'll hold you to that timing as well on the policy statement next week.
Yeah, as I did caveat it with it's subject to change, and I'm going for provisional settlement 17th because it's always on the day we have our senior team Christmas lunch, so
yeah,
without fail.
There's a high correlation there, isn't there? I heard.
Yeah.
I think Nico Heslop was presenting at SLT, Site of London Treasury, yesterday, and I think he said the next 2 weeks. So maybe they are planning for next week, Mark, but he's still covering himself as well because he doesn't know for certain that it'll be next week. So I agree with you. I think it must be next week, but we'll wait and see. Okay, well, we're kind of at the end of our allotted time. I don't want to hold you here longer than we said. So if there's no more questions, what I'll do is I will get the slides onto the website immediately after this. We end the call. I'll get an edited version of the recording as well onto the website probably on Monday. And those people who haven't seen it are welcome to have a look at it on Monday. The last slide is just outlining our offer to fire authorities, and we're still offering the discounted rate that we mentioned at the conference at Warwick last month. So if you want to sign up to our service and see our modelling, same with Dan's service as well, that's all available. Just drop us a line. We're happy to have a chat to you. So it's good. Our first fire funding webinar. Great to see you all, and see you all again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.
Cheers,
Thank
bye.
you.
Cheers.
Bye now. Bye bye.